They were called by a decree, not an invitation, and by the time it arrived, there was no room for protest. In the farthest reaches of the Qing Empire, banners flapped stiffly against wind-stained rooftops as imperial officials moved from compound to compound, reading aloud the words no family wanted to hear. The selection was underway. It was the Elegant Women Edict, issued every 3 years, commanding all eligible daughters of Manchu banner families, aged 13 to 16, to present themselves to the court for consideration. The wording was ceremonial, but the meaning was clear. Send your daughters or risk your clan's standing, your position, your future. It was not a choice. It was imperial command dressed in silk. In din courtyards, girls were washed, powdered, combed.
It is done.
Their mothers
Indeed.
adjusted the angle of their
A heavy
headdresses with
burden she
trembling
carried.
hands, whispering instructions they could barely remember through the panic. Fathers, stoic on the surface, knew better than to speak of sorrow. They walked beside their daughters only until the gates of the administrative office. Past that point, the girls belonged to the dynasty. As carriages rattled toward Beijing, silence swallowed everything. For some, the journey took weeks. For all, the return was uncertain. Behind the crimson walls of the Forbidden City, preparations had already begun. Eunuchs scurried through narrow halls, polishing lanterns, inspecting living quarters, memorizing names. A room was prepared not to welcome, but to erase. Here, a girl would no longer be a daughter of her clan, but a number, a title, a whisper in the records. She would be tested for beauty, but not too much beauty. The Empress Dowager despised threats. She would be judged on fertility, but without showing desire. She would be ranked for virtue, but with no room for pride. Perfection was demanded but undefined. One wrong gesture and she would be dismissed, or worse, selected for punishment cloaked as mercy. When the girls arrived, they were not greeted. They were observed. Senior palace women watched their posture, their skin, their teeth. Did they walk with grace? Did they bow deeply enough? Did they flinch at commands? The slightest mistake, a stutter, a misstep, a glance too bold, could end everything. And yet, those chosen were not the lucky ones. They were the captured. Their old names were struck from the rolls and replaced by honorifics designed to flatten identity. Their dialects were scrubbed clean by endless drills. Their clothing was assigned. Their movement restricted. Their thoughts, if they had any, were kept behind smiles that could not tremble. They became concubines in training, students of silence. Each day was structured to the second, morning greetings to senior consorts, ritual kneeling before portraits of emperors long dead, embroidery hours meant less for skill than for the taming of spirit. They were not taught to think, they were trained to endure. Behind the order was a purpose darker than duty. These girls were not wives, not lovers, not even truly concubines. They were hostages, sent not to rise but to tether. A family with a daughter in the palace would never rebel. The emperor, or more accurately, the Empress Dowager, held the girl's fate like a knife beneath velvet. She did not need to speak a threat, the silence was loud enough. One shift in tone, one misstep by a governor or a general, and the girl would vanish, perhaps to the cold palace, perhaps to a silent burial, always to obscurity. No family would dare risk such a loss. This was politics in its most ruthless form, diplomacy forged through the captivity of the young. The girls themselves understood quickly. Not in words, no one explained, but in how the world around them responded. A eunuch who once smiled no longer looked their way. A fellow concubine demoted without cause became a cautionary tale. The cold palace, they heard, was not cold because of the weather. It was cold because no one ever returned. In that forgotten wing of the Forbidden City, neglected women lived in silence, wrapped in rotting blankets, ignored even by servants. They had no official status, no visitors, no names. They were reminders of failure, political, personal, fatal. To avoid that fate, girls learned to blend. They walked softly, spoke rarely, and bowed so often their spines ached. They watched the senior consorts carefully, noting who was rising, who was falling, which eunuchs were trusted, which were feared. The Empress Dowager Cixi, though rarely seen, was everywhere felt. Her shadow stretched across the inner court like a storm cloud, her preferences unknowable, her wrath unforgettable. She had once been them, a selected girl from a middling family, but she had survived by understanding that in the harem, survival was not won through love or beauty, but through control. Now, from behind the curtain, she orchestrated everything. She chose which girls advanced. She approved punishments. She arranged marriages, not to honor a girl, but to bind a family tighter. Every selection was a move on a massive political chessboard. A daughter promoted meant a father silenced. A daughter demoted meant a clan humiliated. And through it all, the girls never spoke of home. Letters were allowed only once a year, read and censored by palace officials. Often, they were never delivered. The girls wrote anyway, crafting lines full of carefully constructed hope. I am honored to serve, the palace is beautiful, I am learning much. Behind every sentence was a prayer, remember me. Don't forget me. I'm still here. But no one answered. The walls of the palace were thick not only in stone, but in silence. Years passed like seasons trapped in glass, identical, motionless, cruel. The girls watched one another grow thinner, quieter, more shadow than flesh. Some who had once laughed beneath plum blossoms now walked with heads down, speaking only when spoken to, their names fading even among the maids. For those lucky enough to be summoned to the emperor's presence, the moment brought both fear and consequence. A single night might lift a girl into a higher rank or plunge her into disgrace. If she pleased him, she might be named a consort and moved to better quarters. But favor was fickle. The emperor was surrounded by dozens, even hundreds, of women, and he could forget a face by morning. Worse, attention from the emperor could spark jealousies. Other women, more senior, more powerful, might conspire to poison the favored girl's food, spread rumors of her arrogance, or convince eunuchs to misreport her behavior. Punishments were not always formal. A girl might be reassigned to a desolate wing, denied visitors, watched night and day. Her health might mysteriously decline. If she bore a child, especially a son, her life became even more perilous. Imperial sons were rare treasures and political weapons. A child linked her permanently to the imperial bloodline, giving her family a new kind of power. That power threatened the balance of the court. Some concubines were rumored to have miscarried after being given the wrong medicine. Others watched their children die suddenly of fevers or be taken from them at birth to be raised by someone else. The loss was never questioned. The grief was not acknowledged. The court moved on. And so the girls began to fear not only disfavor, but also fortune. To rise was to invite destruction. Many chose invisibility instead, working quietly, never speaking too much, never catching the emperor's eye. They avoided the gaze of senior consorts, memorized the unspoken rules, bowed deeper, smiled softer, and hoped simply to survive. They learned to exist like smoke, present, but untouchable. Meanwhile, outside the palace, their families walked a tightrope. A daughter in the court was both a shield and a target. As long as the girl was safe, the family could claim proximity to the throne. But if she fell from favor, so too might their protection. Officials who dared challenge Cixi's authority found their daughters suddenly accused of disrespect. Some were demoted, others banished to the cold palace, where they would spend the rest of their days in isolation. No one asked why. No one protested. To do so would mean joining them. Even those who succeeded, whose daughters rose to become high-ranking consorts, lived in fear. The court never forgot a misstep. Cixi, in particular, kept detailed records. She remembered slights from decades past. A girl might be smiling in court one day and gone the next, replaced by silence and unanswered questions. The lessons taught were permanent. Loyalty was rewarded with survival, not comfort. Disobedience, even imagined, was punished with erasure. There were no heroes, no celebrations. Only endurance. Among the girls, myths developed. Tales of the one who spoke back and lived, of the girl who ran and was never caught, of the consort who hid her own child and raised him in secret. These stories, passed in hushed voices during sleepless nights, were both hope and warning. No one knew if they were true, but everyone needed to believe in them. They were the only warmth left. The rituals of the palace, meant to impress and intimidate outsiders, became mechanical torment to those within. Lavish ceremonies forced girls to kneel for hours on cold stone. Banquets displayed endless delicacies none of them dared touch. Every motion was prescribed: how to raise a cup, how to sit, how to breathe in the emperor's presence. A mistake brought shame, shame brought punishment. Some girls turned to religion, burning incense and reciting mantras to gods who had long abandoned the palace. Others carved messages into the undersides of wooden bed frames, praying that someday someone would read their truth. But most simply endured. What else could they do? They had no money, no freedom, no name. They were part of a system too vast, too ancient to resist. They had been trained from childhood to obey. The outer world forgot them. Their families, once proud, learned not to speak of them. A daughter in the palace became a memory locked away. Even when the court allowed a rare visit, it was choreographed and censored. Words were rehearsed. Smiles were inspected. Real emotion was forbidden. Any tear might be interpreted as a complaint. Any complaint, a threat. And yet, through all of this, the machinery kept turning. The selection never stopped. New girls arrived each cycle, dressed in hope and ignorance. The old ones trained the new in silence, watching, warning, guiding with eyes alone. Each generation repeated the one before. The faces changed. The fear remained. The years moved slowly for those trapped within the inner court, but outside, the Qing dynasty began to decay. The empire was weakening, its armies humiliated by foreign invaders, its treasury strained, its people restless. But within the forbidden city, the rituals continued as if time had frozen. The girls still knelt. The eunuchs still whispered. The Empress Dowager Cixi still ruled with an iron will softened by brocade. She died in 1908, leaving behind a vacuum and a crumbling system. But even in death, her shadow endured. The young Emperor Puyi, a child barely old enough to read, took the throne, his eyes wide with confusion, unaware that he was the last. The court, now a fading echo of its former glory, continued to select girls even as revolution loomed beyond the Vermilion walls. Fewer families responded. The power of the throne had thinned. Still, some fathers sent their daughters, not out of loyalty, but out of habit, or desperation, or fear of what might happen if they did not. The girls who arrived now found fewer attendants, emptier halls, and a court sustained more by memory than by force. They memorized the same rules, wore the same stiff gowns, whispered the same mantras of obedience, but something was broken. Some dared to speak more freely. Others refused to smile. Even the eunuchs, once the invisible enforcers of palace discipline, now gossiped openly of change. They said the republic was coming. They said the emperor would be dethroned. They said the girls might go home. But no one knew for certain. And for most, it was too late. Those who had spent decades behind red walls had forgotten how to live outside. The gates that had once closed behind them might open, but freedom was no longer something they recognized. Many chose to stay. Others, forced out when the court finally dissolved, wandered the streets of Beijing in silence, unmarried, unnamed, unclaimed. Some found work as servants. A few were taken in by relatives who barely remembered them. Most simply vanished. Their stories went untold, lost in the rush of modernity. The Forbidden City became a museum. Tourists arrived with cameras and questions. They gazed at the throne, the pavilions, the ceremonial garments. Guides spoke of emperors and architecture, of dragons and dynasties. Few mentioned the women. Fewer still spoke of the girls, the quiet ones, the obedient ones, the sacrificed. Yet their absence hangs in the air like incense never fully burned. Their footprints are worn into the stone. Their whispers, though long gone, seem to echo through the corridors. The Qing court mastered the art of using silence as a weapon. And in its final century, that silence was embodied in the daughters it took. They were not warriors, yet they held empires together. They were not politicians, yet their existence dictated policy. Their bodies were not free, but their presence bound generals, governors, and noble houses to the dragon throne. They were not raised to speak, but in their silence, they screamed. The system that used them has fallen. The banners have been lowered. The dynasty has passed into history. But their story remains. Not in textbooks, not in grand memorials, but in the quiet truths that rise when we look beyond the myths. The Qing harem was not a garden of pleasure, nor a place of romantic intrigue. It was a machine built to control, to manipulate, to dominate. And at the center of that machine were girls, taken too young, silenced too long, remembered too little. They were the daughters of loyal clans, sent as offerings. They were dressed in silk and locked in stone. They bowed, they smiled, they vanished. Their lives were not wasted. They were weaponized. And for over 200 years, they helped an empire survive, not through war or wisdom, but through a quiet form of terror, the unbreakable chain between daughter and dynasty.